Hi, delighted to be joining you all today. Just a bit about me and New Schools Network before I kind of kick off. So as Jude said, I joined New Schools Network in 2015, so halfway through its life, and for the last year and a half I've been the director, so leading the New Schools Network. We were set up in 2009 by someone called Rachel Wolfe, who just authored the most recent Conservative Party manifesto. Rachel established NSN to essentially act as a campaigns vehicle on behalf of what you would call a school reform agenda. Over the next kind of year, this translated very much into focusing significant efforts into the free school programme and the free school policy, and I can talk a bit about that. But broadly, NSN kind of existed in this space to talk about innovation, to talk about change, to talk about driving forward kind of agendas on things like new schools, on things like academies, on things like higher school standards. But we've changed quite a bit over the past decade. So when NSN was started, free schools didn't exist. We're now kind of a decade on with 558 open across the country, and they are the highest performing type of school at primary and secondary, and also at post 16. So before I go on to talk about the kind of school reform journey, I'll just talk a bit about what actually a free school is, because it's you know, kind of jargony language that most people wouldn't usually understand. So a free school is effectively a new school. So any new school that was set up between 2010 and now is a free school. The reason that they're set up is a couple of things. Number one, to meet a kind of need for new school places. So the last decade, we've seen a huge pupil population bulge, not enough places in secondary school, in first and primary schools, and now in secondary schools. So providing new school places to these kids. Secondly, to raise standards in areas where there's a kind of high level of disadvantage and low level of educational attainment. Harking back to early 2010, this was a real kind of persistent issue in some areas across the country, where access to a good school place was highly limited, and you had, you know, communities which only had one option of a school to send a child to, and that had been the same for decades. We haven't made as much progress on that one as I'd like, and I'll come on to talk about that when we talk about the future. And then the last thing was around kind of broader innovation in the school system. So if we look at the kind of international comparisons for free schools were charter schools in the US or free schools in Sweden, and both of those types of schools were free from kind of political, so they were free from the local authority. It introduced new ideas in the system and in the sector, which then kind of translated to all schools across England. So if you take this country now, there are some quite obvious examples of that. Particularly, you know, Catherine Birbalsingh at Michaela Free School, which is probably the most famous free school for good and bad reasons, very much focuses on kind of tough discipline, high standards, and a lot of the lessons learned in that school have then been translated to other schools. But there have been far more highly innovative approaches as well. So you'll see schools like XP in Doncaster, which do something called expeditionary learning. So they, you know, get kids in kayaks, and that's how they teach English. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but you know, there are really, really exciting things going on in the free school sector. So that's a bit about free schools. I think the kind of purpose of this discussion today is to talk about next steps for school reform. And obviously, you know, the coronavirus pandemic is going to kind of come into that, but I just want to spend a little bit of time, if I'm not going to run over too much, just talking about the kind of journey, because it has been a journey. And to kind of take it back to today, this all started sort of in 2010. So if you think about, I just talked about free schools, if you think about the kind of incoming Conservative government, this is when school reform kind of went like that. lots of the ideas had already been initiated under the Labour government. So academies, new schools that were not new, but they were kind of taken, they were sponsored by business leaders and taken out of local authority control. But when the coalition government came in 2010, you saw a massive uptick of various different reforms, which focused around kind of key things. So you've got the structural stuff, which I've just mentioned, that's free schools, that's academies. You then got the curriculum thing. So they reformed the national curriculum. They promoted a much tougher exams regime. They reformed league tables. So schools were kind of measured on how much progress that they made for children, and what's called EBAC, so the English Baccalaureate. That's how many pupils entered into kind of core subjects, English, maths, history, and things like that. So we saw kind of 2010 to 2016, there was this kind of rapid expansion, which formed the kind of narrative around the Conservative Party's agenda on education. We hit 2016 and then we hit Brexit. So Theresa May's kind of manifesto and agenda was a lot building on a lot of what had come before, but I'm sure, as you're all aware, and from other talks that you probably get, with this Brexit just sucked the life out of kind of domestic policy. So whilst we saw kind of things that came before maintained, so we had new free schools that were established there, the kind of drive to all of this was lowered. So fast forward to today, just if we take pre-virus and post-virus, so pre-virus, this Conservative government's agenda on schools is like it was before. It's a focus on standards, it's a focus on structural reforms, reforming free schools, reforming academies. It's a focus on behaviour, backing Ofsted, making sure that kids get good GCSEs. But the political landscape has massively changed for this government. I think it's no surprise for all of you that firstly, they've got a majority, which they hadn't had before, but more importantly, the new intake of Conservative MPs are very different to what came before them. Both different in terms of their background. So there are actually quite a lot of ex-teachers who are now in Parliament, but also in terms of where they're being elected from, of which education is a massive concern for them. These so-called red wall seats are the areas where school standards are the kind of lowest, and parent satisfaction with schools, is a concern for them. So they know that their kind of record, what they'll be judged on in 2024, will be what they've done around education. And when you're thinking about broadly kind of public policy and what decisions government takes, there's kind of three angles to that. The first is what the public think. The second is the economic, so how much it costs, but also what's the economic benefit later on. And then the third is the political. And the political here really does kind of matter in terms of what's going to drive forward kind of school reforms and the agenda there. So that was it, kind of, I guess, 2019, before we knew what coronavirus was. And that in itself has obviously kind of changed the landscape significantly as well. And there are a couple of interesting things that I think, particularly with schools, are really influencing the debate about future policy. The first is like the role of parents and kind of parent power. So because of the lockdown and lots of parents were doing homeschooling, and then we were talking about reopening schools, and parents are kind of now used to constant communication from their school, but also a national conversation around what's going on in schools. They're more informed than ever before, and they've also got more opinions than before. I think that's a good thing, and having parents involved in schooling is a really, really good thing. But it does change the dynamic slightly. The second element is that there is greater general public interest in not only education, but also in what the kind of jargony term is, the attainment gap, which is how disadvantaged people achieve compared to the wealthiest. All the research that was coming out during school closure was around kind of access to laptops for disadvantaged people and safe spaces to work. It was about how much pupils at state schools were getting taught per day compared to kind of pupils at independent schools. And then you saw big public campaigns like Marcus Rashford's campaign about free school meals. So that's another kind of angle. I think the last angle is that, to a certain extent, the changes of the last decade, which focused on giving more head teachers autonomy, has kind of worked, and it's been head teachers and MAP chief executives, so groups of schools led by one chief executive, who really led the way, not only in kind of guiding government in what to do, but also in terms of doing things in their own school, getting it done, showing that these things can work, and then you know, and then collaborating and showing that to the rest of the sector. So right, I'll just briefly finish then by the actual topic in hand. So kind of what's next for school reform? So we've seen the journey, we've seen the context, both political and post-virus. I think there are a few things that this government are kind of definitely going to do, but there is one critical thing that they absolutely have to do before they can get any of that done. So the kind of policy actions that I think will focus this government's mind over the next kind of three to 4 years is, number one, kind of what you'd call the north-south divide. It's not quite north-south, but tackling different areas of the country where education and both access to good education and kind of outcomes in education are low. This is linked to a kind of broader levelling up agenda and opportunity and you know, aspiration for these communities, alongside a kind of economic regeneration model for that too. The second, which is different but related, is the kind of attainment gap. So there are, you know, it's not just about areas of the school, of the country, it's about what goes on in individual schools, and, you know, various estimates from kind of lockdown are highly concerning. We're looking at kind of, you know, the attainment gap being reduced by 36%. So they're definitely going to have to intervene in one way or another to do that, and there are a number of ways to kind of do that. And then the last, as I sort of talked about, is finishing the reforms of the last decade. So more free schools, more academies, joining other schools, so forming multi-academy trusts, more accountability to head teachers, and to schools and the sector. Those are the kind of broad things. The critical thing that this government has got to tackle is that it's lost its narrative on education because of school closure, because of, you know, the ongoing kind of pandemic. The Conservative Party themselves are hugely passionate about education reform and school standards, but the kind of bandwidth for them to deliver that is quite low. So what we're seeing at the moment is some kind of general sector fatigue because of coronavirus, but also a broader kind of political backlash from others, you know, outside of the governing party, because the government really needs to put meat on the bones about what this levelling up agenda means for education. And until they can kind of narrate their policy direction, they won't be able to deliver any of it because of, you know, the things that I've just talked about. But that being said, I do think we'll see, you know, expanding kind of targeted investment in communities, expanding or backing things like Ofsted, backing behaviour interventions, backing new free schools. But the thing that, as I said, is lacking is the overall mission. Right, I'm conscious I've gone on for a bit longer than was required, so I'll stop there for questions.